I am Maryah Shewcraft from Ortiz Middle School, and I teach 8th grade U.S. history. And today we are going to be talking about the Civil War and Reconstruction. I know that in our lessons we should be either close to finishing the Civil War and starting Reconstruction, or we are about done with the whole Civil War Reconstruction unit. I thought that since it's been a while since we've been in class, we should go ahead and go back over the causes of the Civil War. Now, I'm not sure how your teacher has taught you, but I like to use the acronym TISSUES to help my students remember the causes of the Civil War. So we're going to go ahead and start with T. T stands for tariffs. If you remember, tariffs are a tax on imported goods. These are goods coming from other countries. The North really liked tariffs because it helped their economy. It helped their economy compete with other countries as far as manufactured goods. Now, the South really didn't like tariffs because they relied on imported goods from other countries, so they ended up having to pay more. And then we move to I, which is industry versus agriculture. Industry is going to be in the North. This is going to be our factories and other types of businesses. These are where majority of the goods in the United States are being produced. And then we have agriculture, which of course this means farming and animals. So the South had large plantations. S is slavery. Now we already know that both the North and the South have different viewpoints on slavery. In the South, their plantations relied on slave labor. Now in the North, we start to see groups like anti-slavery and abolitionist form, and they want to end slavery altogether. This doesn't really work with the South. Now, the next S is Scott versus Sanford. The case is actually Dred Scott versus Sanford. And Scott sues for his freedom after moving throughout the United States, including territories and free states. And Justice Taney pretty much told him and the rest of the United States that if you were of African descent, you were not a citizen during this time in the United States, and you could not sue the U.S. government. So that pretty much put almost a halt to the anti-slavery abolitionist movement. And then we get to U, which is Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin, if you remember, was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, and Harriet Beecher Stowe was an abolitionist. Now, the book is about the evil of slavery, and what it did was, when you were reading it, it really showed how awful slavery was and what the South was doing to people that were human. And it didn't just get distributed in the United States, it actually got distributed across the whole entire world. So now everybody, not just in the United States, was looking at the South. And then we have the election of 1860. Does anybody remember who got elected in 1860? If you guessed Abraham Lincoln, you are correct. This was not who those southern states wanted. They did not want Abraham Lincoln to be president, but he won. So then we start to get talks of secession. And even before really right after Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, we get to our last S, which is secession. And early 1861 is when we get the first state that secedes from the Union. It is South Carolina, followed by 10 other states. And they form the Confederate States of America. Now, Abraham Lincoln really isn't okay with this, and he even says it in his first inaugural address that you can't secede from the Union. It's not possible. So these are the causes of the Civil War, the main ones. Of course, you can also throw in the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act as well, because that has to deal with slavery. All of this is a division between the North and the South. And really that's what led to this all-out war in the United States. All right, guys, so now that we have talked about the causes of the Civil War, we can go ahead and get into our key players. So we're going to start on the Union side with the president, Abraham Lincoln, of course. Abraham Lincoln gets elected, and it is one of the reasons why the South secedes. Now we're going to look at the Confederacy president. They elect Jefferson Davis, who was actually a senator in the United States. And then we move to our generals. On the Confederacy side, we have Robert E. Lee. He is a very good general for the Confederacy to have. He has a lot of experience. And then we have Ulysses S. Grant, who is also very experienced and ends up being a very good general too. So these are our key players during the Civil War as far as leadership positions go. Okay guys, so now that we have talked about causes and some of the people, let's go ahead and talk about some of the advantages between the Union and the Confederacy. So I'm going to use this red marker for every time that the Union, the North, has an advantage to put a check. But before we start going over this part, I just want you guys to think about, who do you think had the bigger advantage going into the war? Who do you think, based off these, would have won? So let's look at population first. Between the North and the South, who do you think had the larger amount of population? If you guessed the North, then you are correct. The North is where we're going to find our cities. If you remember, we have people moving from rural areas into the North, where the factories are developing, where we're getting urbanization because of jobs. This is also where we're going to get a lot of immigrants coming in too. So cities just explode. In the South, it's more rural, small farming communities, like close-knit, so not a lot of people are moving there at this time. Population is also going to play a key point in the Civil War, because what happens if you have more population? It means you have more people to fight, more people to work. So this is going to be a big advantage for the North. Now, let's look at resources. We know in the South they have large plantations, but what is their main crop in those southern states? It's cotton. Cotton ends up being the main crop grown. Now, we also have states that are going to be in the middle of the United States. They're going to be called border states that do have slavery. They were anti-secession but pro-slavery, and they wanted to stay in the United States. We also have the territories where we're going to start to see in like the Midwestern United States, where corn and wheat is grown. So as far as resources, they both have certain crops, right? Now, the North has all the factories, right? So this is where all products are being manufactured. And because you have a large population and people still being able to work, they're going to be able to produce more food, which is going to be very important, especially when we get into the actual Civil War. If you guys remember, during the American Revolution, George Washington was having a hard time feeding all of his troops. Well, that's not going to be a huge issue now for the North, because they have factories. They have people to manufacture goods and provide other services for the military. So we're going to go ahead and put a check by resources. And last but not least, and probably one of the most important ones, is transportation. If you remember, in the North, they start building canals for steamboats, and they start building railroads, and we have those natural harbors. More of them are up north than down south. And during industrialization, what was important about transportation? Yes, it made moving goods and people faster and quicker, which is also important during the Civil War when you're talking about needing to get supplies to troops and moving goods around. So it keeps it going. So transportation is going to be an advantage for the North. So based on this, who do you guys think should win the war? Just based on this alone. It's the North, because they have more advantages as far as population, resources, and transportation. All right. So next we're going to talk about the actual Civil War. I'm just going to go over the main events of the Civil War. All right, so now that we have talked about the causes, the people, and the advantages, we can go ahead and jump into some of the important events during the Civil War. So I went ahead and started with 1860, when Abraham Lincoln is elected president, because of course this is what eventually leads to secession. It's the final straw for those southern states that seceded. And in 1861, of course, is when the Confederacy begins. And we have our first major event of the Civil War, which is going to be Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter is a military base that belongs to the Union. It is off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina, in the harbor. Once the South separated from the North, they told the Union, like, hey, you guys got to get out. This is in our territory. And of course, the Union was like, no, we're not leaving. So the Confederacy gave the Union a deadline. When the deadline came, the Confederacy started to fire on the fort, forcing the Union to retreat back into the North, which is the first major event of the Civil War. At this point, it is all-out war between the North and the South. The first major battle is the Battle of Bull Run. Abraham Lincoln, before Ulysses S. Grant became commander of the Union forces, Abraham Lincoln and his advisors came up with a plan, which was called the Anaconda Plan. What does the snake anaconda do? It strangles its prey, right? So that's what Lincoln wanted to do to the South. He wanted to completely surround the Confederacy to be able to strangle it out of resources, being able to trade. So he cut off their trade with a blockade from the Atlantic Ocean, and then he wanted to surround the troops. Another thing that they thought was a great idea was to completely rush to the capital of the Confederacy, which is what they did in the Battle of Bull Run. This is the first major win for the Confederacy. Stonewall Jackson, he plays a key part in this battle because him and his unit form a wall, hence Stonewall, and they don't let the Union forces come through. So they're forced to retreat back up to the North and kind of regain and re-strategize. This is when Ulysses S. Grant comes in as the commanding general of the Union forces. Then we move to 1862. This is going to be the Battle of Antietam. It is the bloodiest one-day battle in the whole Civil War. Many people die, many people are injured. Up to this point, Abraham Lincoln kind of thinks, well, this war is only going to last 90 days. the North thought it was only going to take a couple months, but at this point it was realized that it's going to take way longer than what they thought. But this ends up being the first major victory for the Union. The Union lost a lot of major battles at the beginning, but now they're starting to win some a little bit more, which moves us to 1863. Now, we have Gettysburg. Gettysburg is the first turning point of the war for the Union. The Robert E. Lee invades the North and he fails. While there was complete destruction to the city around, Abraham Lincoln does get to make his famous Gettysburg Address, which pretty much inspires the people of the Union to keep fighting and why we're fighting, and that we should honor the dead with fighting for what we all believe in. So pretty much the next day is Vicksburg, which is also a turning point for the Union too. This is when the war looks like it's going to be over. Ulysses S. Grant was not at Gettysburg. He was down at Vicksburg. Vicksburg is in Mississippi. Now, he captures Vicksburg, and this becomes very important because what is that very large geographic feature that I'm sure you guys have heard about over and over and over again in class? It's the Mississippi River. So the Confederacy loses control of the Mississippi River and the Union gains control of it, which is huge, okay, because now they can't transport goods. So we have Vicksburg as the turning point. By now, the Union is we're good. During this time, in 1863, Abraham Lincoln also issues the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, do you guys remember what the Emancipation Proclamation is? It's okay if you forgot. We've been out of class for a while. So the Emancipation Proclamation frees all slaves in Confederate-held territory. Why do you think it only freed it in Confederate-held territory and not up in the North? So it was more of a strategy on Abraham Lincoln's side because we have those border states that, if you guys remember, it's two of them are Maryland and Delaware, and they, along with the other two, completely were anti-secession but pro-slavery. So what do you think would happen if Abraham Lincoln said slavery is abolished in the whole country, including the Confederacy? Chances are those states would secede from the Union, and Abraham was trying to keep the Union together, so he didn't want that. So he only banned slavery in Confederate-held territories. Now, what this also does for the South is you have all of these slaves hearing that they're free. So what does that mean they get to do? They get to leave, right? They're leaving. What does this do to the South as far as their plantations? There's really no one there to work them. So now you have people who are in the Confederate Army and they're kind of sitting there going back and forth do I go home and help on the plantation or do I stay and continue to fight? So it also puts the Confederacy in a bad spot too. It also allows slaves and African Americans who were free in the North to officially join the Union forces so that they could also start fighting for their freedom. Frederick Douglass spoke to Abraham Lincoln and he was like, let these people also contribute to fighting for their freedom too. So this is in 1863. We're going to move on to the other dates. Give me 1 second. All right, so sorry, I had to write the last two dates down. So we have 1864, Sherman's March to the Sea. So Sherman, he's a Union general, and he is tasked to pretty much go through Georgia to get to the Atlantic Ocean, which is what he does. Now, what he also does on his march to the sea is he completely destroys anything in his path. He's burning crops, burning houses, he's killing animals, He's ripping up railroads and doing all sorts of stuff that is just destructive on his march to the sea. So then we get to the last and final battle of the Civil War, and it's 1865. It's really not exactly a battle, because by then most of the Confederacy has noticed that they're losing this war. And General Robert E. Lee has a lot of people who desert in his army. Desert just means they leave, not something that you eat. So they go home. And we're in Appomattox. Okay, so at Appomattox Courthouse is when Robert E. Lee is forced to surrender to Ulysses S. Grant. Now this brings an end to the Civil War. Now is when Abraham Lincoln and the whole country is tasked with uniting. Abraham Lincoln has to unite those southern states that seceded back into the United States. So we are going to enter the era of Reconstruction. All right, guys, so let's go ahead and get into the last part of this lesson, which is going to be Reconstruction. So Reconstruction is the era after the Civil War. It is now when the country has to reunite. Those southern states have to rejoin the Union. Now, they can't just rejoin. So Lincoln comes up with a plan. His plan is that each state has to ratify the 13th Amendment, and 10% of the state's population that can vote need to take an oath of allegiance. So that is going to be those Confederate people that are going to have to say, I pledge allegiance to the United States, I'm not going to turn on the United States. That's kind of what the oath was. So Lincoln gets assassinated pretty much right after the Civil War ends in 1865, leaving his vice president, Andrew Johnson, as president. Now, Andrew Johnson is not a favorite of the Republican Party because he's from Tennessee and he was a slaveholder. So the radical Republicans in Congress, which is going to be a small group, completely take over. They try to get Johnson impeached. It doesn't work. It came close by one vote, but they're just not letting him have a say in anything. And Johnson wants to continue what Lincoln wanted to do. Well, that was completely different than what the radical Republicans wanted. The radical Republicans wanted to completely punish the South. They thought that they should be punished for seceding from the Union, which is essentially what they end up doing. So what ends up happening is they send officials, hand-picked officials, down to those southern states and the Union Army to make sure that they are following their rules, what they're supposed to be doing. Eventually, Johnson, when the next presidential election comes, he is not reselected to run, and Ulysses S. Grant is picked. Ulysses S. Grant does win the presidency, and he kind of helps form Reconstruction a little bit more. So within a couple years, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment are approved and ratified by each state. So before we get into that, we're going to talk about carpetbaggers. So carpetbaggers are Northerners. So these are going to be our official or just business people too that are going to come from the North to the South to help the South out during this time. Because remember, most of the war gets fought in the South, so it's completely destroyed. And the Southerners see carpetbaggers as people who are trying to take advantage of the position they're put in. So most carpetbaggers, how they got their name is when they came from the North, they would come with suitcases made of carpet. So they became carpetbaggers. The Southerners also came up with another term, which is scalawags. Now, scalawags are not Northerners, they are Southerners. So scalawags are Southerners who are going along with the Republicans' Reconstruction plan. They're taking that oath. They're agreeing to what's happening. So the other Southerners who were still believing in the Confederacy and didn't like this whole thing would call other Southerners scalawags who agreed to Reconstruction or were for it. Another group of people that we get are the freedmen. Okay, so our freedmen is going to be the population of people that were once enslaved and now are free. We also get the Freedmen's Bureau. So the Freedmen's Bureau is a social service. They're set up to help the freedmen become accommodated to their new life. So they help them with education, medical, food, helping them find jobs, anything that they need help with. But they would also help other Southerners if they were in real need too. Brings us to our next bullet, which is the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. So if you remember back at the top of our list of Reconstruction, the 13th Amendment is the amendment that abolishes slavery in all of the United States. So this gets approved by all states. And then we get the 14th Amendment. This is going to be our Citizenship Amendment. So Congress passes this to say anybody born in the United States is a citizen and protected by the laws and has the rights of everybody else. So this gets passed. And then we get the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment allows all men to vote, no matter their race. The South does have to approve these amendments too and ratify them to their state constitutions. Now, they don't necessarily agree with this, so the South's reaction is going to be kind of a little extreme. They want to keep these freedmen in a form of slavery, so what they try to do is they do black codes and Jim Crow laws, and they also try to do poll taxes and literacy tests. So when it comes to voting, if you can't read or write your name, you don't get to vote. If you can't afford to pay the poll tax, you don't get to vote. The other thing was the grandfather clause, which is also goes with voting. So if your grandpa was not a citizen of the United States, you are not a citizen either. So you're not protected by these rights. They'd also say if you needed a license for certain types of jobs. If you didn't have that license or you were caught without a job, then they would fine you and make you work for free to pay off that fine. So this is why the Union Army was down there, to make sure that they were not treating the freedmen unfairly. Another thing that ends up happening is sharecropping. So sharecropping is you have these large plantations that eventually have to be divided up into plots of land because the plantation owners have no way of farming it themselves and they're not exactly willing to pay somebody to do it. So what they end up doing is they divide their plantation up. A freedman generally would come and they would say, we'll take this plot of land, so they're like renting it, and we'll also take a loan to buy seeds and other supplies to farm the land, with the promise that at the end of the growing season, they will be able to pay off their debt and give half the crop to the owner of that land. Now, this doesn't always work. Actually, it really doesn't work at all. And what it creates is a circle of debt for freedmen, and it's just a cycle. So we also get sharecropping. And Reconstruction officially ends in 1877 with the Compromise of 1877. So the year before was election year, so 1876. And Rutherford B. Hayes is running for president. And the Southern candidate, it comes down to like one vote between both of them. It was a really tight election. So the Republicans sat down with the Southern Democrats and said, hey, so we will take all of the Northerners that are in the South, so the Union Army and anybody that they had sent down that was an official that was controlling and making decisions for laws in the South, they're like, hey, we'll remove them all if you let Rutherford B. Hayes be president, because we do not want him, the other candidate, to be president. And so, of course, the Democrats were sitting there, the Southerners were like, yeah, we'll do that. That sounds like fair, but you have to remove everybody that is from the North that's there to control the South out of the South. So that's exactly what happens. Rutherford B. Hayes becomes the next president after Ulysses S. Grant, and Reconstruction officially ends in 1877. So pretty much what happens after this era ends is the South almost goes back to pre-Civil War time, and we start to get more and more segregation, which is what you guys will cover in the next time you guys take U.S. history. So with that, we are done with today's lesson for U.S. history. I hope you guys have a great day, and thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.